It's now been a year since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a long year full of pain, suffering and loss for millions of Ukrainians, and also a year of regular bravura reports by the Russian Air Force on the destruction of various Ukrainian military targets, which in reality were mostly residential buildings and civilian infrastructure. I could talk all day about the Russians, whether military or so-called ordinary people who find vigorous delight in regards to the death of Ukrainian civilians, but this is aviation history and not the World of Animals channel. Therefore, I want to draw your attention to something else. If you have been following the news of this war, you may have noticed that among all the houses, hospitals and schools destroyed by the Russian missiles in Ukraine, there were also a number of hits on ordinary outdoor toilets. Of course, you may think that those hits were nothing more than just a weird coincidence. It is also fair to think that those news stories could have been just simple fakes created so to mock the Russians. Indeed, it's hard to imagine that the Russian precision-guided Ha-29 missile, worth over $250,000, would somehow lock onto someone's outdoor cottage toilet, which is basically nothing more than a lone standing plastic or wooden box with a small path leading to it. But if I tell you the story of how the Russians back in the 70s used a yellow sand road to cheat on the Ha-29 missile trials, then probably the 2022 Ha-29 toilet hits in Ukraine will no longer look that extraordinary. When speaking about Russian weapon technologies, the modern examples of which are usually just upgraded versions of Soviet-era developments, it is almost impossible to avoid the matter of the Russians copying Western technologies. The Russians usually prefer to either simply ignore these accusations or say that there is nothing wrong with copying. Everybody does it. Even the Americans themselves sometimes copied the Russians, which, to be fair, is somewhat true. Though the main difference is that the Russian military which copies Americans exists in real life, while the American military which copies the Russians is mainly in Hollywood movies. In 1998, the HBO network released a comedy film called The Pentagon Wars. The opening scene of the movie pictures a hearing before the House Armed Services Committee where General Partridge, played by Kelsey Grammer, is accused of using various tricks and gimmicks so faulty weapons could pass military trials. One such trick was the general ordering electric hot plates to be taped to the surface of an armored vehicle so to help the heat-seeking missile find its target. It is indeed a hilarious episode that could hardly be imagined happening in real life, but there is always Russia. The thing is that the funny episode created for this American comedy greatly reminds one of a real-life episode of the Soviet military cheating while demonstrating to its high command the new Ha-29 missile, which refused to lock onto its target. This episode was described by the famous Soviet test pilot Vladimir Kandaurov in his book. But before we dive into this hilarious story, I want you to learn one word in Russian. I bet most of you know some Russian words like "привет", "на здоровье", "бабушка", "балалайка", and judging from the average age of my audience, even such words as "перестройка". However, those are just simply words with only one straightforward meaning. Meanwhile, there is one word that I recommend you learn, which carries a far richer and a broader meaning and in a way may help you better understand Russia and even some historic events, whether of today or 100 years ago. This word is smikalka. If translated from Russian to English literally, the closest meaning would be the word savvy, except it wouldn't be 100% correct, and here is why. The English dictionary describes the word savvy as a practical understanding, shrewdness or intelligence, especially in practical matters, common sense, and it is exactly the latter definition which could not in any way be applicable to the Russian smikalka. Which is why, when translated to English and taking into consideration the Russian reality, arguably the closest to the proper meaning of smikalka would be freaking dumb, especially when it comes to the so-called Russian military smikalka. Basically, smikalka means the ability of a person to find a smart solution in a difficult situation. To be fair, there is nothing wrong with that by itself, which is why words like savvy are present in many languages. However, what makes smikalka different in comparison to similar words is that in Russia it is praised to the highest possible extent on a very cultural level. The thing is that finding a good solution makes ordinary Russian people think of themselves as very smart and even unique. And such a self-perception is extensively cultivated and supported by the Russian leadership, because while feeling proud of their Smikalka, ordinary Russian people forget to question their leadership about how they ended up in that difficult situation in the first place. I know for some of you it doesn't make any sense, so let me give you a fresh example. On this video, soldiers that are about to be sent to the war in Ukraine learn with surprise that the Russian army will provide them with only a uniform, while the rest of the military equipment they should take care of themselves.
Это все свое, мальчишки. Вам форму, все, что армия, вам броню, вот это все, что касаемо военного. Этого ничего нет. Наших мужиков мы сами все укомплектовали. По медицине тоже. Мужики, только не ржать. Жен, девушек, матерей просите, прокладки. Самые дешевые прокладки, плюс самые дешевые тампоны. Тампоны знаете для чего?
Нет. Кровь останавливает.
Пулевое ранение, прям туда вводите и все, он начинает разбухать и придавливать стенки. Это то-то, то-то, этого, это, медицина. Мужики, сами о себе позаботьтесь, пожалуйста.
Had this video appeared in a normal society, the very least reaction would be resentment about such a barbaric attitude towards your soldiers. Meanwhile, in Russia, the main thing they see in the video is a smart solution in a difficult situation. While in a normal society, such a video would certainly raise big questions about your leadership, for the Russians, the video only reaffirms the supremacy of the Russian mindset. I mean, how would you otherwise explain the fact that no other army in the world has come up with such an elegant solution of using tampons for wound treatment? For the Russians, the explanation is obvious. It is military smikalka. And Russian history is full of such examples of military smikalka, which in essence are simply freaking dumb and tragic, because the outcomes of their seemingly smart solutions are at best useless, but most of the time are simply harmful to their own interests. But today I want to tell you the story of a rare Smikalka example which was actually hilarious and quite amusing. It is the story of the Ha-29 missile and its 1979 trials. In the mid-70s, Soviet ground attack aviation was facing a big problem. The actual ground attack component was seriously complicated due to the lack of a capable precision-guided weapon. The thing is that the recently adopted Soviet air-to-ground missiles like Ha-23 and Ha-66 appear to be relatively weak for the efficient destruction of an enemy's frontline targets, such as command posts, bunkers, bridges, depots, etc. This part of the problem, however, was relatively easy to fix and could be solved by simply increasing the explosives weight in the missile's warhead. The hard part was guiding the missile to the target. The thing is that until then, the precision-guided air-to-ground missiles were primarily radio-controlled. To put it simply, the pilot would first have to find and visually identify the target, launch the missile, and then, while visually tracking the flight of the missile, would manually guide it towards the target using the radio control system in the cockpit. The drawback of such an approach, other than its poor accuracy, was that the pilot had to simultaneously guide the missile and control his aircraft while flying towards the target. That, in turn, meant exposing the plane to anti-aircraft defenses, whose capabilities had developed significantly, and thus there was a huge risk of the pilot being shot down while guiding the missile to the target. One of the possible solutions to this problem would be the so-called fire-and-forget missiles. After their launch, such missiles did not require further external intervention, so the pilot could turn away his aircraft back to safety and would not need to enter the danger zone. Unfortunately, radio guidance could not deliver that. What could was video. Or the television guidance system, to be precise. The problem, though, was that back then this TV system didn't exist and was yet to be developed. That is, it hadn't yet been developed in the USSR, since the French and British, as well as the Americans, had already tested and even tried in action TV-guided bombs and missiles. Put simply, television-guided missiles use an optical contrast seeker for their guidance. Such missiles have a video camera in the nose that transmits a grayscale image to the screen in the cockpit, so the pilot can locate, identify, and then lock the missile onto a high-contrast target. A huge advantage of TV guidance is the fact that after the launch, the missile will guide itself towards the target, thus leaving the pilot free to maneuver the aircraft and, if needed, avoid or evade possible threats. Also, since the missile is guided to the contrast image saved in the missile's memory, the missile is resistant to various electronic jams. However, TV guidance' primary advantage is at the same time the very reason for its main flaw. Its accuracy is highly dependent on the visibility of the target, meaning such missile can't be used at nighttime or in harsh weather conditions or when anything else makes the target less visible. Even simple smoke from explosions on the battlefield or just the camouflage of the target can seriously confuse the missile seeker, causing it to lose the target lock or even accidentally lock onto another high-contrast object in the vicinity of the intended target instead. Such a drawback is typical to pretty much any existing TV-guided weapon, and the Soviet Ha-29 air-to-surface missile wasn't in any way an exception either. The Soviets' intense work in the 70s on developing improved air-to-ground weaponry resulted in the appearance of the new Ha-29 missile. In comparison to the previous Ha-23 missile, the Ha-29's warhead was 3 times heavier and was capable of causing serious destruction. For instance, when attacking concrete runways, the missile left a crater in the ground with a diameter of 15 meters and about 6 meters deep. A huge advantage of the new missile was its modular design. A simple change of the warhead could switch the missile to either television or laser guidance. However, laser guidance still required highlighting of the target, whether by the pilot himself or by someone on the ground in close proximity to the target. In contrast, the TV version of the missile was capable of utilizing the needed fire and forget principle. Kind of. As Vladimir Kandaurov recalled when working on the MiG-27K, which was supposed to become the most advanced ground attack aircraft in the Soviet Air Force, he was also involved in trials of the new armament, in particular the trials of the Ha-29 air-to-surface missile. As he recalled, the new missile was great, it was big, it was powerful, and could accurately hit even the smallest target, like you could aim not at the building but at a particular window of that building. That was possible, however, only if the missile could properly lock on the target, which the Ha-29 had some big issues with. To be fair, having and fixing issues with new weaponry is not at all unusual. All in all, this is exactly the reason test pilots and engineers exist. However, the initial troubles with the Ha-29 were a little bit too much even for such an experienced test pilot as Kandaurov. What made things worse was that on top of the technological issues, there were also some other unique complications. As Kandaurov wrote in his book, one day he was called to his commander, who ordered him to fly to one of the shooting ranges to take part, as he said, in the big show, which was supposed to be the demonstration of the new types of aircraft armament to the Soviet High Command. Kandaurov honestly replied that the Ha-29 was still in a raw condition and its level of readiness was such that just a simple smoke left on the firing range from the preceding performer could completely blind the missile seeker and thus ruin the show. This is why you go there and figure something out on the spot, replied his commander, demonstrating the highest level of mastery of the drop responsibility on someone else's skill. After arriving at the firing range, Kandaurov reported to General Lev Supran, the deputy chief commander of the Soviet Air Force, who was responsible for the overall organization of this new weapons demonstration. The entire range is camouflaged in a natural green color, explained General. We want to test our new weapons, including the Ha-29 missile, in close to real conditions. Your task is to destroy the plane inside the hangar. Do you think you can hit the hangar's gate? Asked the general. Kandaurov honestly replied that there was gonna be a big problem. He had already made a test flight over the range and found that the Ha-29 seeker couldn't lock on literally anything in that spring greenness. What? This is utterly unacceptable. How dare you say this to the second highest commanding officer of the Soviet Air Force? Such a defective missile shouldn't be demonstrated at all then, would have said the general in any normal country except Russia. Any ideas what to do? Asked General Supran instead. Paint the hangar's gate yellow, suggested Kandaurov. I don't know what you call the number which just by the tiniest fraction is bigger than 0, but this number would perfectly describe the probability of NATO painting all their military objects yellow in case of war with the Soviet Union. However, for the Russian military Smikhalka, that was not of any importance at all. The next morning, General Supran approached Kandaurov on the airfield and told him in a conspirational tone not to worry because the previous night the matter had been taken care of, exactly as Kandaurov had asked. And even better. Kandaurov relied on the general's words, jumped in the cockpit of the MiG-27, took off and headed to the shooting range. At the scheduled time, he entered the zone and started his combat approach, anxiously looking for a yellow spot among the greenness on the firing range. As he recalled later, to his surprise, it wasn't that easy, and he had already started getting nervous since he was almost out of time when he finally noticed some bright spot ahead of him and started preparations for the missile launch. The missile seeker, though, stubbornly refused to lock on the yellow spot. After a few unsuccessful attempts, he managed to get a weak lock and just shot the missile in that direction, hoping for the best. He swiftly turned his aircraft to the right while watching on screen the flight of his missile. The missile was quickly approaching the target, and soon he saw on the screen how the bright spot formed into the hangar's gates, which were quickly getting bigger and bigger in size. But then all of a sudden the missile's crossbar started to go down away from the gates and switched to a bright road in front of the hangar. Kandaurov just helplessly watched as his missile's lock went further down the road and hit the ground in front of the hangar, leaving both the hangar and the aircraft inside untouched. As he later recalled, he was stunned and confused, and while flying back to the airfield, he was vigorously trying to figure out where the heck that bright road had appeared from right in front of the hangar. He learned the answer right after landing. General Supran, who was waiting on the airfield, told him that they had been worried about Kandaurov, and so at night they had made a yellow sand road leading to the hangar so to help him and his missile find the target. Unfortunately, to the Ha-29 missile seeker, the yellow sand appeared to be brighter and more distinct than its surroundings, thus making the missile lock on the sand road instead of the hangar. I don't know how General Supran came up with the idea of a yellow sand road, but I can't help but thinking that in May 1979, at the exact same time, the famous Elton John was visiting the USSR with his show, which in particular included the well-known song Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Anyway, this fail didn't stop the development and trials of the Ha-29, and eventually the missile was accepted into service in 1980. The Ha-29 was then widely used and exported to all the countries that were operating Soviet-made aircraft, and eventually became the most common and popular Soviet and then Russian-made missile in the world. The Ha-29 is still in service, and in particular the Russians often use it against Ukraine. I don't have the exact answer to why the sophisticated and expensive Ha-29 missile, when attacking, as the Russians say, targets of strategic importance, also hits ordinary outdoor toilets. Maybe it's just a coincidence that happens again and again. Maybe it's just because almost 17 million households in Russia don't have a normal indoor toilet, and thus the Russians consider all toilets as targets of strategic importance. Or maybe it's some weird technological glitch that makes the Ha-29 forget its target and go back to its roots and follow a yellow sand road that sometimes happen to lead to an outdoor toilet. When I mentioned earlier that Russian history is full of such examples of military smykалka, I wasn't exaggerating by any means. Cases of military cheating similar to the Ha-29 had been happening in Russia not only in the branch of aviation, but also in the Navy and ground forces. They had been happening during peacetime as well as in the hardest days of World War II. They involved ordinary Russian people as much as the top Soviet leadership, such as Nikita Khrushchev, for instance. If you want to know more, watch my video about a few other cases of the Russian military cheating, now available on my streaming service Nebula. Nebula is a place where top educational creators like Mustard, Real Life Lore, Not Just Bikes and many others upload new videos every day, and where you can enjoy watching videos without any ads or sponsor messages. Since recently, along with access to amazing educational content from your favorite creators, you also get free access to Nebula classes, where those creators teaching you how they create and how to be, well, a successful creator. This is something I wish existed when I started my own YouTube journey. However, the best part of Nebula, if you ask me, is that it's a unique place where you can watch exclusive content, made possible because creators of Nebula don't need to worry about censorship that can demonetize your video for simply saying a few words that YouTube may consider as potentially shocking for the audience. This is exactly what happened to my video about a small airplane crash in Paris. I don't want this to happen again to any of my future videos, especially considering that I have big plans for the year 2023, in particular to make new videos more often, as well as start a second channel. If you have ever considered supporting my work, then watching my videos on Nebula would be one of the best ways to do that. So join me on Nebula, click the link below and get a Nebula subscription with a special discount for fans of Paper Skies. Do that now and I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.